Today, I'd like to introduce and welcome our author, Stephen Baker. Stephen Baker has written for Business Week magazine for more than 20 years, covering Mexico and Latin America, the Rust Belt, European technology, and a host of other topics, more recently including blogs, higher mathematics, and nanotechnology. He's always considered himself a foreign correspondent, however, an approach that he says has been particularly useful as he met the Numerati. That is today's book, The Numerati. Publishers Weekly says, in this captivating exploration of digital nosiness, business reporter Baker spotlights a new breed of entrepreneurial mathematician, the Numerati, engaged in harnessing the avalanche of private data individuals provide whenever they use a credit card, donate to a cause, surf the net, or even make a phone call. According to Baker, these crumbs of personal information, buying habits, or preferences are being culled by these Numerati to radically transform and customize everyday experiences. To talk to us about the book and some of the ideas contained therein, Stephen Baker.
Thank you. Hello. Am I wired up? Can you hear me? My publicist told me, mapped out this tour, and this is the first stop on the tour. And she said, okay, the first stop is Google. And I freaked out a little bit because the last thing I wanted to do, this book is basically written not for people at Google, but for everybody else in the world who's trying to figure out what a lot of you are busy doing, which is figuring out the patterns and desires and interests of humanity. And I do not come to this subject as an expert. I am rare. I guess I could say I'm never an expert in anything I write about. What I do is I've made my career as a generalist, and I go to places that are very interesting. I find people who I think are changing history, and I ask them some of the stupidest questions you can imagine. But I think it's an approach that helps me move from one subject to the next, and I'm always learning about things, and I enjoy that. As Heath said, I was in Mexico, and I was a Latin America person, and then I came up to Pittsburgh, and I was doing Rust Belt coverage. I was covering steel mills and aluminum. And this was the mid-'90s. The Netscape IPO had happened, and I kept getting smaller and smaller space in Business Week for these fascinating stories I was writing about steel. And so I began making my way from downtown Pittsburgh up to Carnegie Mellon University and talking to the people doing software and robotics, and then the people doing liver transplants at Pitt. And I kind of moved into technology. And then I was lucky enough to get sent over to Europe, where I did European technology. And since I've come back, I keep on doing different things that have nothing to do with each other. I did nanotechnology, I did blogs. I did one story about Google last December. I wrote a story about your colleague, Christophe Bisilia, and his cloud initiative. And that was a lot of fun to do that story. But this one, I don't think I waded into any story as ignorant as I was when I waded into math. I decided that there was a competitive issue for the United States, that we weren't graduating enough engineers and mathematicians, and it was going to hurt our technology industry. And so I was going to look into math and where math fit into it all. And I began calling up all these mathematicians at MIT, and I went to Bell Labs. And after a month, I was utterly confused. I'd learned about this much math over a big, wide stretch, and I didn't have a focus for the story. And I didn't until I went to IBM, and I met this stochastic analyst named Samer Takriti, who told me that he was culling the data from 50,000 of his colleagues and trying to build predictive mathematical models of IBM consultants, and that this was going to be part of workforce management, and they were going to deploy them more efficiently this way. And I thought, well, if Takriti can model 50,000 of his colleagues as workers, then other people in other industries must be able to do something similar with us as shoppers and voters and potential terrorists, etc. And that's where the idea for the magazine article and later the book came into focus for me. And I was as excited as a very ignorant person who's learned something important. And I called up my college roommate, who has a PhD in computer science, and I raved to him in a voicemail. I said, "Listen, I just did this talk at IBM, and this story I'm doing is going to be the mathematical modeling of humanity, and it's just going to be incredible." And I went on, and about a day later, I was on the West Coast, and I was driving to Google. I was going to go see Craig Silverstein at Google, and I get this very concerned phone call from my roommate, and he says, "Have you ever heard of garbage in, garbage out?" I said, "Well, yeah, I've heard of garbage in, garbage out." And he says, "Have you ever heard about the drunk looking for the key under the light post?" And I hadn't heard that when he told me that the guy's looking for the key where the light is and not where the key is. And I said, "Okay, I get your point. I get your point." So I toned it down a little bit. And about an hour later, I'm talking to Craig Silverstein in the outdoors atrium there at Google. And I say, "Have you ever heard that story about the drunk and the key?" And he says, "Of course I've heard that story." And I said, "Well, is that relevant to what you're doing?" He says, "Yeah, one time when I was in junior high school, there was a science project to do. And I did this thing and I came up with all this great data. And then I realized the experiment wasn't quite right, so I tried to come up with another experiment to fit the rich data that I already had. And at that point, I said to myself, okay, mathematical modeling of humanity is going to start in areas where people can afford to make big and frequent mistakes. And advertising is a logical place for it to start." So about 3 days ago, I had lunch with a direct marketer in Toronto. It was Friday. And he's writing this story for a direct marketing magazine. I thought it's kind of a joke because these people know more about what I've been learning than practically anybody. Most of what this closing the loop and direct marketing, a lot of what Google does is handed down from direct marketers. So he said, "Do you have any lessons for the people that read this magazine?" I said, "Not a one. I don't have any advice for direct marketers. They know what they're doing much better than I do." And then I went into my talk about how I'm a generalist and how that I see what's going on with the people that I call the Numerati, which is a new name I came up with, and I can tell you how I came up with it later, but how I see them in domain after domain analyzing the data and coming up with new industry models, and how there used to be what we perceived as a divide between the humanities types and the engineering types, and the humanities types specialized in humans because we were way too complex for the engineering types to figure out. And so those of us who studied humanities were pretty safe and secure in law and journalism and publishing and teaching and all these other domains of the word, and how now I see that we're producing all of this data and we're handing it right over to the engineering side, and they have the tools to go through that data and to figure us out and to basically storm the industries that have previously been dominated by the humanities. And there's no better example than you for that trend. And what's more, despite the cautions of my college roommate, I do see this mathematical modeling of humanity, and we're at a very early stage right now. But I do see eventually companies, governments, whoever it is, coming to a very detailed understanding of who we are, what we want, where we go, and what we do. And I know that's pretty much part of your company's vision for the future, and I kind of agree with it. And a lot of it is going to take place with the rest of the material world, with all the sensors that are telling us about oceans and all the rest, and it's going to create this parallel world that's going to reside on big clouds of computers, as far as I can see. So I told him that, and he said, "Yeah, but do you have any advice for direct marketers?" I said, "No, I don't. And I don't have any advice for Google either. But the one thing that I think helps as a generalist in this field is that a broad perspective is really useful because there are lots of cases where the tools that you're building, the analysis that you're doing, can move from one domain to the next and create breakthroughs where you least expect them. I was at Microsoft Research in last October, and I met a researcher there named David Heckerman, and he was specializing in spam guard, and he was analyzing, well, in the trying to figure out the patterns of spammers. He was really trying to figure out how they were changing the spam to get past his defenses, and he thought it's basically like trying to anticipate mutations. And so he's also an MD, and he moved his entire research into the battle against HIV. And the same algorithm worked, or didn't work, according to me, but the same algorithm was useful in fighting spam and HIV. And in my research, I just came across countless examples where you could take the most fabulous leaps from one domain to the other. One of the first people I talked to when I was doing this book, and the guy who's on the front page, is Dave Morgan of Dakota. So he was telling me about behavioral advertising. And the day that I was talking to him, he was really intrigued because there seemed to be this correlation between people who like romantic movies and this particular advertisement for Alamo Rent-A-Car. So what was it that drove romantic movie lovers to Alamo Rent-A-Car ads? Well, he didn't know, but the point was, and it's not, it's just one of thousands and thousands of little interesting puzzles that he faces and that you face. But the point is, you can do more research. You can go down the data and you can look and see what the patterns are and the correlations. And that is a kind of thought process that goes through a lot of the statistical analysis. And later I was in Iowa, and I went to Iowa to, they have the the best center for eye research. And one of the things I wanted to do in the book was look at myself, because it would make it more readable that way, I thought. And my father went blind when he was about 85. And so I thought I'd go to the eye research place and find out what the chances were that I'd go blind in my old age. That was the hook for my chapter that later was killed. Anyway, so I'm talking to the doctor about eyes, and they've built a model of an entire rat's eye, the genome of the rat's eye. And the rat's eye, despite its beady appearance, is very close to our eye. So they're looking in the rat's eye for all of these connections. What causes this? What causes that? And the correlations that he described to me were almost exactly what Dave Morgan was talking about with the Alamo car rental and the romantic movie lovers. It was the same thought process. And that was a bit of a revelation to me, although later that chapter was killed because it didn't have enough Numerati in it. But the point is that what's exciting, I think, about what you folks do is that you're connected to all these other domains. And so if you do come through with a breakthrough in analyzing our behavior on media, it might actually lead to a breakthrough in medical research or in counterterrorism or who knows what. So I think that's what's really exciting about it. I thought I'd tell you just a couple of the areas that I looked into in the book. The first that I started to mention was IBM, where they're culling a lot of this data, and they called after the article, and they assure me that, and they're very concerned, they assured me that all of the workers at IBM have opted in to have their data analyzed. And I won't go into the details of my reporting, but that's what they want to make very, very clear, and they're very sensitive in this subject. We had a cover story in Business Week that talked about how IBM was doing this. It was an excerpt from the book, and I think it got a lot of people angry at IBM, both inside the company. And I wanted to, it just seems so natural to me that if you have a workforce that is doing its work on machines that produce digital data about how they work, that it would be natural for a tech company to analyze that data to try to fine tune its workforce. And I did want to talk to you about whether you think that would be normal or not, because I would automatically assume that Google would be analyzing your data to try to figure out your patterns and to try to optimize you. So maybe we can talk about that later. But also I went to Oregon, where Intel has wired the homes of several hundred elderly people with lots and lots of sensors. So they have sensors that measure the patterns of their footsteps, their daily wanderings, the strength of their voice, the amount of time it takes them to recognize a known voice on the telephone, how often they open the refrigerator, how much they weigh. They go on everything that they can measure. They're measuring about these people. And then they're trying to establish baselines of these people's behavior so that when they see deviations, they can infer that maybe the person is coming down with Parkinson's disease, dementia, or is losing muscle mass or balance and is in risk of a fall. And so I found that interesting because I had parents who got into their 90s in Portland, and I was 3,000 miles away, and I was thinking, I would really like some of those sensors in my parents' house, although it's a bit intrusive. But it raises the question of if you get, and if we surround ourselves with sensors, or no, put it this way, if an insurance company calls you up and says, we'll give you a 40% reduction in your health insurance if you agree to surround yourself with these sensors, will you do it? And then you say, I don't know. What are the pros and the cons? And the pros are, well, we'll keep an eye on you and we'll tell you about the stroke before you get it instead of afterwards. Now will you do it? I don't know. But I think those are the kinds of questions we're going to be getting as we provide more and more information about our behavior and our movements. It's already happening in the auto industry, where a company called Progressive is giving people discounts on their auto insurance if they agree to put a black box in their car. And then they can see how fast they accelerate, what neighborhoods they go through, if they go through dangerous neighborhoods, what hours they drive, etc. And if you think about it, right now, insurance companies, as far as I know, my car insurance company doesn't know anything about me. All it knows is there's an absence. They have nothing to know, and so they keep giving me the same rate or trying to raise it, but they don't know anything about my behavior. And I think in the world we're entering, we're going to be measured less on the results and more monitored by the data that we produce minute by minute and our behavior. And that's going to open up all kinds of opportunities for companies like yours. I was one of the things that I think is going to happen if you look a century from now, I think historians will look back and they'll have all of this data that started coming in around 1995, and it will be as though the world sprang to life at around the beginning of this century, and they could start looking at what we do and not just looking at what we said we did. I was at one of your competitors at Yahoo, and I was talking to the head of research there, Prabhakar Raghavan, and he was telling me that sometimes you can have too much data. And he talked to me about overfitting, and this was all new to me. And so he gave me the example. He said, if you drink a bottle of Portuguese red wine, and you live in Montclair, New Jersey, where I live, and somebody finds that you have that bottle of $10 Portuguese red wine, and they look around the area for everybody that's had Portuguese red wine, they might associate you with this very strong cluster in the city of Newark. And it's a bunch of Portuguese people. But the fact is that the reason I drank the wine wasn't because it was Portuguese, it was because it was $10. And so he said you can lose a lot of time chasing down things like that and waste your time. So about 2 weeks later, I'm at the National Security Agency, and I'm talking to the chief mathematician there in Fort Meade, Maryland. And, you know, they've been getting a lot of our internet communications, a lot of our phone communications, and it's been very controversial. And so they have enormous mountains of data in which hopefully they can find terrorist activity and ferret it out. But I was asking him about some of that process, and of course he wouldn't tell me about the specific details. But I said, you know, I was talking to this guy at Yahoo, and he said sometimes you can have too much data. And I went through what Raghavan had told me in my stammering and primitive way. And there was a moment of silence, and he looked at me and said, you could never have too much data. So he said, you might ask it the wrong questions, you might not know how to manage it, but you can never have too much data. And that was, for me as an American, it was a chilling moment. But one of the things I would like to, people ask me where this is all going. And one thing I want to ask you is if what I'm telling them is right. My thesis is that as people get more sophisticated about the data that we're all producing and how it's being used, where it's going, how it's being interpreted, that they're going to demand, and companies will provide ever more sophisticated tools to help us control our data, monitor it, dole it out to people and see how it's used. And it seems to me that that's going to be a big industry and a big market opportunity for companies like Google. And I guess I'd just stop the talk right here, and I'd like to throw that out if you think that is there going to be that, and will there be markets for data?
If you have questions, feel free to use the microphone.
Yeah. Yeah, or any other questions, really?
So I think you are ignoring the social consequences, or how humans or societies work. Because you are interested in technology, in what people can do and cannot do.
Right.
I think the social process, for example, with a great sense of, or maybe a concern about Big Brother, or too much data being abused by governments and big corporations. And that is something that is not controlled by technology. It's more controlled by social sciences, by politicians, by journalists. And they could give a good story why data is good. For example, you take care of your elderly parents, or you could give it interesting about innocent people that are being thrown to jail because of overfitting of data.
Right.
So and society behaves in sometimes irrational ways.
Yes.
And this is, in collecting data, is based on laws, on conventions, and on political processes.
Right.
It could be that this avalanche of data will be misused by somebody, and then will be a backlash, and it will be forbidden, or something else. So what I'm looking at you is this overly optimistic way of looking at the world, like in Wired magazine. Wired magazine thinks technology will solve everything, but it's not correct. You have to show profit. You have to make sure that people not get angry at you. So I'm thinking what you're showing is just one way of looking at the world. There are many other ways of looking at the world. Probably the end result will be something in the middle.
Okay.
And we at Google here are much concerned about what you consider being googly, which is more of kind of an organized chaos. Let people be, don't interfere too much on people. So it's a good question what you're talking about. Yeah. But regarding measuring what people do, I think if the local supermarket will look at how fast the teller, whatever, the customer service people or the cashiers type or handle customers. It'll be a huge backlash.
Yeah, but see that kind of monitoring is really 100 years old. That's workforce management, that's Taylorism. And it's just looking at their behavior and trying to optimize their speed
Yes.
and their efficiency. If you try to get more detailed into it, you get into what their interests are, what they're really good at, what they do best. No?
Who knows?
But one of the things I would say in terms of the backlash, everybody, if you talk to people, they all claim to be really concerned about privacy. But if you offer them trade-offs, I've found many people opt for convenience over privacy, and they opt for economic savings over privacy, and in national security, they opt for the promise of being safe, and they're willing to sacrifice quite a bit of their privacy for that. And so I see it as something that boils up and might reach the politicians, but often the people tend to be a bit ambivalent about it.
Could be. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, you mentioned Taylorism, so I wonder if you know that we had a tremendous backlash against Taylorism and against these sorts of studies in the early to mid last century. And in fact, as a result of unions working very hard, there are a number of states today where I believe possession of a stopwatch on a work site is in fact against the law. Because people were fighting about time and motion studies.
Right.
And this is one of the things that's come up with, you mentioned the opportunity. You've got all these people on computers. You can see essentially second by second what they're doing. A number of people over the years have said, yes, we should build tools to study workforces. But it turns out that in a lot of states in the United States, monitoring activity on a computer is considered to be the equivalent of holding a stopwatch, and is thus something that you cannot do.
But you can monitor it for SEC violations. You can monitor it for spam, for pornography.
Right.
They're monitoring every.
Just the particular laws get triggered whenever there's
Yeah.
a timing element involved.
Right.
Okay. And the laws, when they were written, of course, didn't anticipate the wider consequences. But something that's always bothered me about sort of statistical analysis or making inferences based on a person about what their future behavior will be,
Right.
for instance, school systems in Europe. I used to live in France. You used to live in France. Also, I was in Germany, some other places. My daughter has just come over from England, and I'm very happy she did. In part because while she was in the English school system, they were constantly trying to figure out whether or not she was going to go to a university. And it was based on their tests, it was based on her performance, on sort of various indicative systems that they had over there. And it's sort of an experience that my ex-wife went through as well. She essentially got bombed out of the French system because they decided, given their various indicators, that she wasn't right for university.
Yeah. But
brought her over here to the States, and she ended up being a straight A student at good schools.
But look at
and we have to be careful about how we use these techniques and where. It's one thing to show somebody an ad. It's another thing to decide what the rest of their life will be.
That's right. But if you look at yourselves, I would imagine that all of you are highly employable at other companies in your domain. And so if Google were to choose to go through your emails and try to optimize you, your satisfaction, happiness would be one of the constraints. I mean, it would have to be a very sophisticated system that is designed for people who can leave if they want to. And so I'm not saying it's easy. It's research. It's not happening right now, but that's what they're trying to do. And it would seem to me that what I see is the world and the workforce dividing into sort of two. And one, people are dealt with as commodity workers. They either are replaced by machines or they're treated like machines. And then there's the creative knowledge workers who have to be coddled. And if the system is going to try to understand them, it's got to be extremely sophisticated and loose.
I should probably warn you, you probably realize this already, but because we are Google and because we spend so much time analyzing the data, we are horribly sensitive here to the implications, and I think very hesitant. Often people suggest that we should do things that I think seem completely fine to normal people, but if you're in the inside and you know what the tools can do, just sound horrifying.
Okay.
And So it's probably a tougher audience here than most because we
that's-
know too well what can be done and what we will not do.
All right.
Don't be evil is important to us.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned that that this is sort of the research phase and that this isn't being used. Like people aren't actually going through and picking people not to choose to invite to an interview based on like sort of their their likes and dislikes and their hobbies. But I'm wondering.
IBM?
Sorry.
You mean at IBM?
Yeah, like how they're using this to find out more, but this is not the main system. And I think people are sensitive about the misuse of information, mostly in that if it's used against them, they consider that misuse, I would say.
Right.
I'm wondering if this is kind of analogous to the same things being done in genetics, where, scientists who are studying genetics, the public is concerned, like, is this going to turn into eugenics? Are we going to stop, pregnancies that look like it has a high likelihood of, problems in childbirth and things like that?
Right.
And I'm curious, where is that? Do you think that, genetics and biology is much farther along and they've sort of reined it in and people aren't so scared of that now? Or do you think that, like, information and the research that people do into sort of this numerati, what are all these connections, is that fundamentally different? And where is that going?
Well, I don't really know. I mean, it seems to me that both of them are wrestling with the predictive power and neither side has it been nailed down very convincingly. So all they can do is suggest that there seems to be a trend towards this in this person, or this person seems inclined in this direction, and they can't really nail it down. Like in genetics, there are a couple of genes that you can say, okay, that person's going to get Huntington's disease, that person's going to get a couple others, but the rest of them are really, really complicated and haven't figured them out yet. And I would say the same is true about any kind of behavioral profiling that companies are doing. Anybody from the rest of the world? Okay. Well, I just I guess my only question that I haven't had answered, Bob talked about a little bit, but are there going to be tools to help us? Are there going to be tools? Is this going to be a big market for tools to help us control our own data? And will that give birth to new markets, new data markets that we can sell into? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, there's a tough issue with tools to control your own data. This is something I think probably from your experience when you were doing blogging. Remember Steve Gilmore and some others were always talking about the attention economy and such,
right.
About how people ought to be able to build up these tremendous databases of all the stuff they've done and sell access to it and trade access to it and the rest. One of the things you have to, it's very comforting to think about having tools and to giving people choice. But the reality is, in many environments, it's pure sugarcoating. If somebody comes to you and they say, for instance, I'll give you a 40% discount on your health insurance as long as you're a good one, if you give me the data, or if you come to my book selling place, and I'll give you a 20% discount if you give me your movie viewing history. Right. Same as when you go to the supermarket. They give you, I get discounts all the time because now they know the patterns of what I buy.
Right.
What happens over time is that even though you've got the opportunity at each individual sort of transaction point to decide whether or not you're going to give away the data, the average person always gives it away. So providing the choice isn't really, it feels good. It has all of the form of a decision that's being made, but in fact it's not a real decision. It's almost like a Terraform contract. Yes, you can say no, but on the other hand, if you say no, you don't get goods and services, you don't get discounts, you don't get whatever. So we have to be careful when we talk about tools to understand that they don't bring us probably what we expect they'll bring us. They don't bring us the kind of control that technically could be applied, because the social systems will result in our just giving away the data.
Okay. Well, one thing, I mean, people talk about, oh, no, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to that I think that data is so freely available that if you can't get it from one resource, you can get it from another.
Yeah.
If you're not getting the pure data that you like from this company because of some privacy thing, they can do an end run around you because it's the nature of data.
Right.
To a certain extent, my walking up to this microphone and making these words, it's not protected by anything.
No.
It's just sort of, I'm here, I'm making this action, and anybody who watches this later on YouTube can, make a little data record on me, says she spoke this date, blah, 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 blah. They don't have to be involved with Google.
Right.
They can just, it's just out there.
Right.
Data to me seems to be like just so easy. It's really about who can provide the best service of data, who can really give you the best results that are positively market tested. And I also think that trying to protect data and trying to protect your personal data, it's almost like very analogous to what happened with the music industry. They have all of this content that they tried to protect left and right and make suits and, you can't touch this. And it all imploded. And it's still imploding. And the way that people make money off of music now is more about performances and services.
Right.
So commodities, their value drops all the time.
Right.
And data is just another commodity.
Right. And those of us who don't want to, there's some people who talk about going off the grid and not providing their data, but life gets more difficult for them because there are no payphone booths around. It takes longer to wait in line to drop the quarters in the Easy Pass. Our society's kind of conspiring against them.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Sure.
I think in the abstract, we're all sort of intellectually excited about possibilities of data, new possibilities technology brings. But there's sort of like a wide-eyed optimism here that I think everyone's wants to caution against. We've heard a few comments. And I think it's just there's an intuition here that how is sort of improved data portability, organizations of data, how is it most likely to be used? Probably as a mechanism for domination and control, and not as a mechanism to actually improve people's lives. So I guess, it's hard to get really excited about that, is all I'm saying.
Could you just go on a little bit more about the domination and control?
Well, I mean, who's just like the sort of choice issue that it's Bob who brought up.
Right.
There are ways to structure these things such that, the average person is going to actually sacrifice a lot to a powerful institution or, company, government, whatever. And ultimately, it's not the powerless people who are going to have control here. And so, it seems like this is act one of a sort of dystopian science fiction movie.
Okay. And do you think that in my remarks, I'm kind of embracing this science fiction future in a wide-eyed way?
It seems to me just sort of an issue of making the right disclaimers is all it would really take to probably satisfy an audience like this. Like, look, we need to be very careful. But this is very exciting, as opposed to just sort of this is very exciting. Okay.
Fair enough, because I'm going to be talking to other tech groups, and I want to get my. Well, I don't want to come across as a wide-eyed guy. In the book, I talk about the areas where it has the most promise, and the areas where it has the most promise are those where mistakes can afford to be made, and people's privacy really isn't affected. Things like in supermarkets or in the market research, the analysis of blog posts and social networks where you try to find out sentiments. And, those are areas where people are already making a lot of money and they can afford to if they get it right 4 out of 5 times, it's pretty good.
I feel like maybe the workplace optimization sort of struck a chord because here we all are at work and nobody's that interested in being second by second monitored.
Right.
And we talk about sort of you're right. There's you have an opportunity to leave, but sort of in a frictionless world, yes. But if you license the software, a workplace optimization software to lots of different companies, and lots of different companies are using it, sort of like the opportunity to move isn't that easy, and a lot of people are going to be stuck in the system where they're, unfortunately being spied on, every second. So.
Yeah. Well, I kind of see that. I see that happening. Because IBM, when they talked to me, they said, after in World War II, operations research was built, and it was used. One of the first applications was to optimize the convoys that went across the North Atlantic so that they could get past the German U-boats. And then after the war, IBM turned its attention to using that same science to optimize its own supply chain. And it did it very well, and then it created a business where it sold that knowledge and that service to companies around the world so that they could run their supply chains more efficiently. And then they said to me, and now an enormous percentage of our revenue and even a higher percentage of our earnings is coming from services. So how do you optimize the supply chain when your machines are now people? And they said, well, we start by looking at what the people are doing. And again, I say as in a disclaimer because they're very strong about they're extremely concerned about this, that the information's done on an opt-in basis. But I don't see it remaining on an opt-in basis at a lot of places going forward, because I think that companies our data, at least some lawyers would say that our data does belong to them if it's done on their machines, and they do have the right to do that. And of course, it could change our behavior, because we could do all kinds of end runs to keep secrets and to try to maintain a shred of privacy. But I believe me, I'm not. I appreciate your alert, but I'm not looking at this. I don't think I'm looking at it wide-eyed. I actually think I'm looking at it kind of with a bit of concern.
I don't mean to accuse you of being wide-eyed, but it's just when we start thinking about the potential of these things is sometimes bad.
But I do think it promises to change things dramatically. Yeah.
I think. First. I think the idea of the threat is a lot less if you tend to think of this data in terms of aggregate. Yes, when you think that you could be singled out and your individual behavior could be monitored, it is a bit more threatening. But most of this stuff is used in aggregate, and despite our individual fears of being monitored, there's not enough time and there's way too much data in most instances for. I don't know. The other thought I had was exactly what you're talking about with the. Currently, you get a discount if you opt in.
Right.
At some point, maybe there'll be a tipping point where you actually have to pay to maintain your privacy. My mind went there as soon as you talked about the auto example, and that day may come. I don't know. I guess the answer to your question is in the intersection of social science and economics, because economies of scale and scope are the trade-offs that we use every day. And think of the adoption of any technology. I'm thinking now of clothing. Once upon a time, everyone's clothes were absolutely tailored to them. Today, tailoring is reserved for the uber wealthy. Right. I mean, all of us buy ready-made clothing. Tailoring is something that's possible, but you have to pay a very high premium for it. I suppose many things are going to go in that direction. But you think, okay, tailoring gives you the ultimate in customization, but free market forces also give you a tremendous variety of color. I just bought shirts the other day at Century 21, The varieties, the colors, the brands, the makes, the models, the European versus US styling. There's such an infinite variety of depth and breadth that it really doesn't matter that you're not able to get pure customization, because you can pretty much find what you want in the market. And it's almost like digital photography. I remember years ago they're saying it'll never replace film, because we're dealing with bits and bytes and little, but the quality has just evolved so much now that, anyone who made that claim would be ridiculous. Yeah, there'll be people who are always using film and they're gonna have to pay a premium to get their hands on it, but I don't know. It's I don't have the answers for you, but some of this we can look back and see, clothing, for instance.
I just wanted to talk quickly about what it means for something to be opt-in, especially in the context of a company that might be using this information to monitor you and give you a promotion and perhaps determine your salary, right? So something being opt-in in a very technical sense that you actually have to click the checkbox. in order for the data to be collected, right? That's not necessarily the same thing as it being opt-in in a holistic sense, where it's not going to be used against you if it's not being collected, or the checkbox itself doesn't really fully explain what it means to opt into the system.
Right.
So it's definitely another issue that needs to be thought about along this personal collection of data. And also, earlier you made a comment about whether or not there might be markets for data. And I think that it's pretty clear that there already are. Especially you can see this from credit card providers who have like partners with whom they share purchasing data, or
No, I meant for us.
for individuals,
Yeah.
as in employees or
Well,
in general.
employees or consumers.
So credit card data is consumer data, presumably,
No,
right?
but we can't sell, as far as I know.
Oh, for ourselves.
Yes.
Okay. Whether there will be personal market for data,
Yeah.
right? That wasn't
that's-
clear to me.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't
Okay.
make it clear.
So that was all I had to say.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be a personal market for data.
Yeah.
All the data that's out there, it's too much to digest for
Right.
an individual consumer. But
Yeah.
I think that there's going to be companies and products and tools that can help create products based on analyzing that aggregated data that then works for the consumer in ways that we have not explored in our markets at all. I mean that well beyond Google. So if you're looking at whether consumers can use data for their own purposes versus products that leverage that data that's already been analyzed in some way that benefits the consumer.
Like computer dating or something.
Like health monitors or
Yeah,
some,
okay.
things like that. Like those the movement monitors that you mentioned.
Right.
Because that movement, or whatever kinds of conclusions that they drew from other aggregated health data, that then works in terms of those monitors. That's the product that it's serving the consumer, and that you would potentially be interested in,
Okay.
and not the data from before that.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right. Okay. Anybody else? Guess that's it then.